Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this evening. We are thrilled to be here with you tonight. I'd first like to do a couple housekeeping things before I turn it over to the presentation. Next slide, please. For interpretation, please click on the interpretation icon for Spanish, Mandarin, or Cantonese to hear a simultaneous interpretation of the session. During the question and answer, staff will be available to provide language assistance for Spanish, Mandarin, and Cantonese speakers as needed. Spanish, Mandarin, and Cantonese speaking participants may also contact us for additional assistance via email at dcpcityofyes_dl@planning.nyc.gov.
Por favor, haga clic en el símbolo de interpretación en español, mandarín o cantonés para escuchar la interpretación simultánea de la sesión. Durante la sesión de preguntas y respuestas, estará disponible asistencia para interpretación en español, mandarín y cantonés para quien lo necesite. También nos puede contactar para asistencia adicional al correo electrónico dcp_dl@planning.nyc.gov. Muchas gracias.
Next interpreter, please.
請點擊同聲傳譯嘅圖標，以收聽會議的西班牙語、國語或者粵語嘅同聲傳譯。在提問環節期間，工作人員會將根據需要為你提供西班牙語、國語或者粵語嘅翻譯嘅幫助。如需更多嘅幫助，講西班牙語、國語或者粵語嘅參與者，亦都可以通過電子郵件嘅方式去聯絡我哋。我哋嘅電郵係 dcp_yes_planning.nyc.gov。
大家晚上好，请点击同心传译的图标，以便在会议上听到西班牙语、国语、粤语的同心转译。在提问的环节上面呢，工作人员会根据你的需要提供西班牙语、国语或粤语的翻译帮助。如果需要更多的帮助，讲西班牙语、国语和粤语的参加者，可以通过电子邮件的方式 dcp_city_of_yes_planning_planning.nyc.gov 与我们取得联系。谢谢 ，Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you go to the next slide, please? Now, before we get to our main presentation, I wanted to introduce Edith Suchin, our Executive Director of DCP of the Department of City Planning, is here with us tonight and will offer a few words about the City of Yes.
Hi, good evening. Yes, thank you, Lara. I'm Edith Suchin, Executive Director of the Department of City Planning. To all of you who are here this evening, thank you for joining us to talk about our City of Yes initiatives. As Mayor Adams said when he announced City of Yes in June, these proposals focused on economic recovery, affordable housing, and sustainability will remove red tape for small businesses, expand housing opportunities in every neighborhood, and accelerate the transition to our energy future. New Yorkers are not going to wait around while other cities and other countries sprint towards a post-pandemic world, and now we won't have to. These proposals are critical to our future. As we face three simultaneous crises, the climate crisis, economic impact of COVID and the housing crisis, we need to say yes to greener buildings, yes to jobs, and yes to more housing in all our communities. And to get them right, we need guidance from you, the public, as we draft the proposals. So starting with getting to a greener city, you may know that New York City's buildings are responsible for 70% of our carbon footprint. City of Yes is a vital part in a broader strategy to use green power to light, heat, and cool our homes and offices. Through these zoning changes, we can make it easier to install solar panels, improve energy storage on a building by building basis, and clear the way for efficient energy retrofits. For example, today we generate about 300 megawatts of energy through rooftop solar panels every day. By removing zoning barriers to solar panels on buildings, City of Yes would more than triple the amount of energy New York City can generate through solar power over the next 8 years to 1,000 megawatts. That additional energy is enough to power over 70,000 homes. Our carbon neutral work is much more expansive than just solar panels, but these are an example of how we can get to a healthier and more sustainable city. Next, City of Yes for economic opportunity. It will help small businesses across the city to open, grow, and thrive. For example, City of Yes would create the largest expansion of space available for small-scale production in more than 60 years by allowing small producers like art studios, food manufacturers, apparel makers, and woodworking shops to locate and grow in commercial corridors for the first time without additional zoning approvals. This is long overdue and will help fill some vacant storefronts. And finally, like our reforms to make our city greener and those to support small businesses, we are working to increase the number of homes in New York City, including income-restricted homes. To do that, we need to expand and diversify the type of housing we permit in our many neighborhoods across the boroughs, and City of Yes seeks to do just that. Today, for example, we allow buildings to be slightly bigger when they offer income-restricted housing for New York City seniors. Our housing initiative would give the same benefit to those who include other types of income-restricted housing, including supportive housing. We need to make it easier to deliver affordable housing as of right, and this move alone could create capacity for tens of thousands of new affordable homes in high and mid-density districts. We are also looking to put people before parking by strategically reducing excessive parking requirements. This too would unlock the potential for tens of thousands of more homes. Cribs, not cars. Tonight's gathering is part of the start of our public engagement process on the City of Yes initiatives. We are moving away from a model presenting a final product and asking for your blessing. We are shaping these plans in real time, and as we build these proposals, we are looking forward to hearing from you. We'll have details on more public info sessions available in the near future at nyc.gov/engage. Again, thank you so very much for joining us. Now back to you, Lara.
Thank you so much, Edith, for those really important words. If we could go to the next slide, please. So just a little background. If you've been to a DCP session before, you will see this is very similar. During the presentation, if you have questions that come to mind, you can submit it by using the Q&A feature. Oh, sorry, we have to go to the next slide. The Q&A feature, staff will collect the questions and queue them up for the live Q&A session following the presentations. Once we start the live Q&A portion of the event, we will then have two options to ask questions. You can continue to submit written questions, or you can raise your hand. If you're phoning in, press *9 to raise your hand. When your name is called, you will be able to use the buttons at the bottom of the left corner of your Zoom screen to unmute yourself and turn on your camera if you'd like. If you're joining by phone, I will give further instructions at the end of the presentation on how to unmute. We will alternate between written questions and those who want to ask questions verbally. With that said, if we go to the next slide. We have been able to, we've had the opportunity to have Borough President Gibson from the Bronx wanted to give a few remarks tonight, but she couldn't make it, so we have a recording to show you.
This is Bronx Borough President Vanessa L. Gibson, and I'd like to thank Chair Dan Garodnick and the entire city planning team for starting the conversations early to discuss the merits of the 3 proposals, getting information out early for New Yorkers to understand and ask questions. I wanted to share why I believe this is an important set of proposals. The 3 proposals include zoning for zero carbon, zoning for economic opportunity, and zoning for housing opportunity as part of Mayor Eric Adams' vision for a more inclusive city of yes. Through the zoning for economic opportunity, the proposal will remove zoning hurdles that will help to support many of our small businesses who we know are truly the fabric of our great communities. Allow for the City of New York to grow, to adapt and change to meet the changing needs and continue to allow for economic growth within our city. The zoning for zero carbon proposal will truly help to promote renewable energy, green infrastructure, green jobs, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions by allowing for building retrofitting, creating options for additional solar panels and electric vehicle charging stations. Removing restrictions will allow New York to meet the clean energy goals that are important for the short-term and long-term health of our neighborhoods and our great city. While zoning for housing opportunity is early in its development, it is important for the future of our city to ensure that there is truly enough housing for all New Yorkers who need it. Housing is a fundamental right, and everyone should have access to affordable, quality, and safe housing, and unfortunately, our production is lagging behind the demand. The city is going through a housing crisis today, and removing zoning hurdles when appropriate to unlock additional housing options can truly help create additional housing for our communities, for our families, and for all New Yorkers. Zoning is an important tool that can help enable or prohibit growth, and these 3 zoning texts will really help to remove many of the hurdles that have been restricting growth in our city. I am looking forward to further discussions of these text amendments entering into the public review process so that New Yorkers can hear and understand and ask questions and ensure that they are truly a part of the decisions that we are making on behalf of all New Yorkers. Once again, this is Bronx Borough President Vanessa L. Gibson, and I am proud to provide remarks in support of these 3 zoning amendments, and I want to thank Chair Dan Garodnick once again and the planning team. Thank you.
We're really happy that Borough President Gibson was able to submit some comments into this conversation. Last week, we also held an info session. This is the exact same presentation of last week. And we also were joined last week by Dan Garodnick, Chair of the CPC and Director of the Department of City Planning, as well as Borough President Levine from Manhattan, Borough President Richards from Queens, and also Council Member Sanchez from Bronx. So with that, we're going to dive into the presentation for the City of Yes proposals. And we will follow with questions, and please use the Q&A chat if you have questions that you want to, put into the queue. I'll pass it off to Nihilus. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nihilus Klingel, and I'm a planner in the department's zoning division, and I'm leading our research on how zoning can support our city's climate goals, and specifically achieving carbon neutrality. I'm excited to share some of our research with you tonight. Next slide. First, I want to take a minute to frame our conversation. Why are we even talking about carbon in the first place? It's important to emphasize we're facing a climate emergency, and it's largely fueled by global carbon dioxide emissions. Carbon dioxide makes up the vast majority of the United States' greenhouse gas emissions, 80% in 2019. Carbon dioxide generally comes from human activity, specifically the combustion of fossil fuels like diesel, gasoline, natural gas, and home heating oil. In 2016, the world community joined together to sign the Paris Agreement, a vision to curtail human greenhouse gas emissions in order to limit overall global warming to 2 degrees Celsius and thus prevent further environmental damage associated with climate change. Here in New York City, we've been implementing this vision through a number of initiatives under the umbrella of achieving carbon neutrality by reducing the city's emissions 80% by 2050, or 80 by 50 for short. Next slide. So what do we mean by a carbon neutral city? It's a city in which we've focused on reducing operational carbon emissions in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. It's a city where we've reduced our overall energy needs. And to do this, we'll need to retrofit almost every building in the city to become highly efficient and reduce wasted energy. Second, it's a city where we've cleaned the grid. And to do this, we'll need to switch from fossil fuel generated electricity to renewables like solar and wind. And thirdly, it's a city where we've electrified all of our remaining energy needs. That includes our vehicles and our buildings as well. This means moving away from fossil fuel-fired furnaces and boilers to newer electrically powered technologies for heating and cooling, such as heat pumps. As you can see from this chart, the key driver of our city's carbon emissions, by far, is our building sector. And there's a big relationship between our buildings and the zoning laws that govern them. Next slide. When it comes to our research, we're building on a strong foundation. 10 years ago, in 2012, the department issued Zone Green, the first comprehensive overhaul of our zoning to support emerging green technologies like rooftop wind and solar. We were dipping our toe in the water, but we could have gone further. In some ways, you can think of the research now as a follow-up to Zone Green, a chance to revisit it 10 years later, to update it and to adjust it in light of many of the technological and legal changes that have come since. These include, since 2016, the focus on decarbonization, coming from the Paris Agreement and 80 by 50. They also include feedback from architects, engineers, and advocates about issues they've identified and ideas they have for improvements, as exemplified here in this report from the Urban Green Council called Zone Greener. This also includes updating the zoning to reflect the Climate Mobilization Act at the city level, especially Local Law 97, which will impose strict fines on large buildings which do not reduce their carbon emissions, as well as the CLCPA at the state level, which in particular set ambitious solar and energy storage goals for the city. Next slide. This leads to the project City of Carbon Neutrality. As a citywide text amendment, it will have the ability to positively affect every zoning district type across the city, in every community district, and in every borough. We're focused mainly on removing obstacles. There are so many challenges home and building owners are facing in responding to our climate emergency. We're busy analyzing our zoning regulations to ensure that zoning isn't one of the things holding people back from making climate-smart investments. To a lesser extent, we're also taking a look at incentives, in particular, existing zoning incentives, to make sure they continue to work into the future. For example, aligning existing zoning incentives with the way that the new New York City Energy Code works and will work in successive updates into the future. And finally, we're taking a particularly close look at solar and energy storage in response to the city's and the state's very ambitious goals for these technologies along time horizons that are much sooner than 2050. For instance, New York City's goal, as mentioned at the beginning, to have 1,000 megawatts of solar installed by 2030. Current estimates have us at around 300 megawatts currently. Next slide. Specifically, zoning for carbon neutrality, or City of Carbon Neutrality, would focus on fixing impediments in 4 key areas. These are also the 4 key categories from our city's roadmap to 80 by 50. These include supporting a renewably based energy grid by broadly allowing for distributed generation. That's specifically in our case, wind and solar, as well as critically needed energy storage. It also includes supporting the retrofitting of our building stock. That means getting zoning out of the way of making our buildings clean and efficient by accommodating a wider range of building retrofits. Supporting our transition of our transportation sector to electric vehicles by removing restrictions on where electric vehicle charging and micromobility infrastructure can be placed. And finally, when it comes to our solid waste and stormwater streams, complementing other city efforts to reduce our solid waste and stormwater output by updating and clarifying related zoning regulations. To give you a sense of the issues we're looking at, which can get into the weeds technically pretty quickly, tonight I'll show you 5 key examples of the types of problems we're looking into. Next slide. The first example has to do with rooftop solar. 10 years ago, in 2012, Zone Green created new rules to allow rooftop solar to be installed above rooftops, even above the zoning height limit. However, we were also greatly concerned with preserving neighborhood character and instituted height limits on the panels themselves, setbacks from the street, and overall rooftop coverage caps. The intent was to keep solar installation small and inobtrusive. However, since 2012, the climate emergency has grown, and we realize the need to get as much solar installed on our rooftops as possible. If you overlay our zoning rules, as well as other rules adopted since 2012, including new fire department setbacks, the result is that only a small portion of the rooftop can be used for an elevated solar canopy. To illustrate this, in this diagram of a typical mid-density building rooftop, the red tinted portions of this rooftop solar canopy would not be permitted under our current zoning regulations. Only the portion outlined in green would be allowed. At scale, across thousands of buildings, this zoning limitation will hold our city back from meeting our solar goals. Next slide. The next example relates to energy storage, by which I mean really big batteries. Energy storage is a key component of a clean energy grid, saving energy that's generated by the sun and wind for times of peak demand, such as summer evenings, when millions of New Yorkers return to their homes after a busy day and crank up the air conditioning. We can't just fire up another fossil fuel powered turbine like we need when we need, like we used to. Energy storage systems, or ESS for short, will be needed at grid-owned sites, but also at the point of consumption, embedded in our city's neighborhoods where energy can be pre-positioned to help avoid brownouts or the use of dirty peaker plants. But energy storage isn't addressed in zoning. There's a special permit from the Board of Standards and Appeals, but this process has been used by very few. It takes multiple years, and it can stymie the rollout of this urgently needed emerging technology. We have been, and will continue to, work with our partners at DOB and FDNY to explore safe and appropriate as-of-right allowances to support the broad adoption of energy storage across the city. Next slide. The next example relates to building retrofits. Basically, every one of our city's million buildings will need to be retrofitted for efficiency and electrification. Zoning can be a barrier in a number of small technical ways. One example shown here relates to what we call a recladding of a whole building. If a typical mid-century office building removes a thin, in this case, let's say 4-inch curtain wall on its exterior, to replace it with a thicker, in this case, 11-inch high-performance wall, they run into a problem. Zoning considers wall thickness part of the building's FAR, or floor area ratio, basically the amount of square footage or development rights you are permitted on your property. If your building was built to its maximum FAR, as is generally the case, then replacing your curtain wall with a thicker one would increase your FAR, which is not allowed. This zoning prohibition stops this retrofit dead in its tracks. This is an example, among many, of small technical glitches that we are cataloging and planning to resolve as part of this work. Next slide. Now, we'll turn to the transportation sector. We know that New York City is lagging when it comes to electric vehicle adoption. A fraction of 1% of the nearly 2 million private vehicles registered in New York City are zero emission. There are a lot of hurdles to EV adoption: cost, supply chain, federal policy. Zoning may not be the biggest issue, but we believe it is a contributing factor. That's because in dense urban environments, one of the biggest challenges to owning an EV is finding an off-street parking space to charge the car overnight. Now, on-street charging is regulated by the Department of Transportation, and our zoning rules regulate off-street parking, and specifically EV charging, in one of two ways. First, imagine a freestanding electric gas station where members of the public can pull up and charge quickly. These facilities are not allowed in the widest range of zoning districts in the city, something that we're looking at expanding. Second, zoning does allow charging to be added to the existing parking facilities as an accessory use. However, this doesn't override the rules around how the parking space itself is used. If the space was required by zoning due to the construction of a residential building, that EV charging infrastructure can only be used by residents of the building. We're looking at loosening this up so that if a building owner invests in EV infrastructure and it's underutilized because residents don't have EVs yet or just went out of town for the weekend, we want zoning to allow for other EV owners in the community to be allowed to benefit from that underused infrastructure by charging up there when it is unused. Next slide. Lastly, I'll turn to our solid waste and stormwater for an example of how a small change could make improvements to our stormwater collection. While our waste stream is a relatively small part of our city's carbon footprint, it does have some straightforward solutions. For example, when stormwater flows into our combined sewer system, it's directed to our city's stormwater treatment plants, where it must be cleaned before being returned to the environment. However, this water could instead be retained on site. And one way to do that is through the use of bioswales or rain gardens, which absorb extra stormwater during storm events and slowly release it over time. Now, zoning requires street trees to be planted along the sidewalk whenever a new development or an enlargement occurs. However, zoning only specifies that these street trees be installed in a standard street tree pit, like the kind we see every day. There's an opportunity here to update these rules to allow for other innovative designs, such as rain gardens designed by the Department of Transportation and the Department of Environmental Protection, depicted here to be used as well. And with that, I'll pass things over to Matt to share our work on City of Economic Opportunity. I'm looking forward to your questions following the third presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Nihilus, and good evening, everyone. My name is Matt Waskevitz, and I am a planner here at City Planning in our Economic Development and Regional Planning Division. And I'll be speaking with you tonight about City of Economic Opportunity, which is the second of our initiatives within the City of Yes. Next slide, please. City of Economic Opportunity will do many things that will be designed to address, make it easier to make a business able to locate or grow in New York City, and take aim at storefront vacancy by modernizing and clarifying our city zoning, allowing a wider variety of activities that can create vibrancy on our commercial streets and lower the cost and the time it takes to start a business in New York City. There are three main goals in the City of Economic Opportunity. The first goal is to create a more resilient economy by allowing existing spaces to be repurposed to support economic activity. And so we know that the pandemic has been especially hard on so many of our small businesses. And so we're looking from top to bottom throughout our zoning resolution to see where we can make our zoning work better for businesses across the city. Our second goal is to allow for the creation of new space that will be flexible to meet the needs of businesses and can help grow jobs. As the economy changes over time, we want to make sure that the spaces that we're building are able to change and adapt as the economy changes in the coming decades. Finally, our third goal is to bring more jobs closer to where people live, especially in transit-accessible locations across all 5 boroughs. And so over the next few slides, I'll walk through some illustrative examples of challenges that we've heard here at City Planning, and that we think that this initiative can help address and really just jumpstart and accelerate our city's economy and recovery coming out of the pandemic. And at the end, I'll summarize some of the changes we hope to make in our zoning as part of this initiative. Next slide, please. In our first example, we have a bike shop owner on the Upper West Side, and they've been looking to do some bike rentals and repairs in addition to the bike sales that they do. It's a pretty typical range of services for a business like this. They're in a neighborhood commercial district, and in the district that they're in, bike sales are allowed, but bike rentals and repairs are not. And this is a product of a zoning code that is frankly, in many instances, outdated and unnecessary and may be very confusing for business owners to understand where they can locate and what they can do in their space. And so this initiative, City of Economic Opportunity, will modernize our zoning and clarify it so that it can reduce the cost and time it takes for small business owners to figure out where they can locate and what they can do with their space. And giving entrepreneurs clarity about where they can rent space for their businesses can save them tens of thousands of dollars. Next slide, please. In our second example, we have an artist in one of our higher density commercial districts who's in Harlem and is interested in opening up a studio to teach art to children. He's found a great space with lots of high foot traffic, but in this particular zoning district, art studios and many other commercial activities are not permitted on the ground floor. And so at the moment in our zoning, the artist will have to keep looking to find another zoning district that would allow an art studio to be located. New York City has over 8,500 vacant storefronts. City of Economic Opportunity will take aim at this storefront vacancy crisis by allowing for a wider variety of activities to occur in our commercial districts, opening up more spaces for new kinds of businesses to locate, and then reducing storefront vacancy across the city, creating thousands of jobs in all 5 boroughs. One of the ways we hope to do this is by fixing some outdated prohibition on activities on the ground floor, like art studios and dance studios. City of Economic Opportunity will allow these businesses to locate on any commercial street. We think it just makes sense. Next slide, please. In our third example, we have a building owner in Sunnyside, Queens, and they've had some difficulty leasing space over the last few years. But recently, a high-tech manufacturer reached out, and they're interested in leasing a floor of this industrial loft building. However, zoning right now requires the number of loading docks that a building has to be based on the current use of the building. And so if they're changing from an office-based use to a manufacturing-based use, they might have to physically retrofit the building to add additional loading docks. And this could be so cost prohibitive that it might not be possible for the building owner, and it could result in this space staying vacant. And so we know that many of the kinds of industries that are wanting to locate in New York City, the nature of manufacturing has changed a lot over time. And so many of these activities don't need the same kind of requirements that we used to have. And so we want to have buildings and spaces that are able to retrofit and change over time. And this will allow us to do so. Next slide, please. In this example, we have an owner of a tapas bar. They have live music on weekends, and they're interested in setting aside a small space for dancing. However, they're in a C1 district, one of our neighborhood commercial districts, and that they're not permitted to have any dancing in our zoning right now. A few years ago, the city repealed the cabaret laws that have a history rooted in discrimination, and the city council had voted to remove these discriminatory laws. But our zoning still prohibits dancing of any kind in many of our commercial districts. City of Economic Opportunity will address this discrepancy and bring our zoning into alignment with the city council's intention when they repealed the cabaret laws. Next slide, please. In this example, we have a bakery owner who has had a successful bakery, so much so that they are interested in expanding what they do to an additional vacant storefront adjacent to the store. However, in our zoning at the moment, bakeries are not allowed to have more than 750 square feet of production space, or else they would be considered a food manufacturer and they would be limited to one of our industrial areas. So unfortunately, right now in our zoning, there is not a path forward to growing a business like this in this location. And so City of Economic Opportunity will expand the amount of space that a bakery can use for production activities, but it will also, for the first time, allow small scale producers like food manufacturers, but also apparel makers, woodworking shops, and other kinds of businesses that would like to produce and make stuff and sell them in the same location to grow and locate in any commercial district across all 5 boroughs. And in fact, City of Economic Opportunity represents the largest expansion of space available for local manufacturing in more than 60 years. Next slide, please. In this example, we have an owner of an industrial building in Sunnyside, Queens. It's a 1-story building on the left-hand side of this photo here. And the building owner, the business owner, he operates a film lighting rental business. They've been growing and they're interested in expanding the building upward. Ideally, they would like to add a couple of extra floors of offices and production space, and then have some storage for their equipment on the ground floor. However, when they reached out to city planning to explore a zoning change, they discovered that today's zoning, in fact, does not have any tools that would allow the 3-story industrial building that they would like to build. And because they're expanding, they might have to relocate outside of the city in order to expand their business. So City of Economic Opportunity will create some new tools in our zoning that can help industrial businesses grow in place rather than having to locate elsewhere. Next slide, please. In our next example, which is our last one this evening, we have a community member who is concerned about the impact that dark stores, like a 15-minute grocery delivery company, might be having on the neighborhood. They think that the fact that the windows and doors have been papered over are harming the pedestrian experience on the commercial street. And so our zoning does have some ground floor rules that govern design in some locations, but the rules change from neighborhood to neighborhood and they don't apply in this area. So as part of City for Economic Opportunity, we're looking to create more clear and consistent streetscape rules that can make sure that our sidewalks are properly activated and create economic vibrancy. Next slide, please. So bringing this all together, what will City for Economic Opportunity do? City for Economic Opportunity will create more spaces and flexibility for businesses to locate and understand where they can locate across the city. And it will address many ways in which our zoning might be outdated, or some of the rules just don't make any sense anymore, or might be confusing, especially for small business owners. And so we want to make sure that our zoning is fostering and creating new economic activity across all 5 boroughs, in every main street, in every commercial neighborhood, and in every part of the city. And so we're going to do this in several ways. The first is to allow the same types of activities or uses in similar districts. So our C1 and our C2 districts, these are the neighborhood retail streets. We think that they should have the same mix of businesses. This was the example of the bike shop owner that I mentioned earlier. Similarly, we think that our office and our regionally serving districts of higher density, these are our C4, C5, and C6 districts, we think that they should permit a similar range of activities and make sure that businesses have flexibility to find space that works for them and ensure that our neighborhoods can be fully occupied and activated. As part of this work, we're wanting to remove restrictions that exist currently in our C4 and C5 districts that don't permit many uses to be along the ground floor near the sidewalk. This is the example of the art studio I gave a few minutes ago. As part of City of Economic Opportunity, we're wanting to be more permissive with particular activities that are constrained by our zoning right now. And this includes small scale production of clean varieties like 3D printing, but also all kinds of custom manufacturing that's like not allowed right now in our commercial areas. So these are things like woodworking, making jewelry, and making ceramics. But we also think that businesses in a small scale should be allowed to produce goods and sell them in the same storefront to their customers in their neighborhood. So these would be businesses like brew pubs and coffee roasters and ceramic stores. And so we think that in a small scale, if you look at other cities across the country, they allow this kind of entrepreneurship and innovation to occur. And so we want to make sure that New York City, with all of its creativity and all of the New Yorkers that are starting businesses every day, that they have enough space throughout the city to do that. As part of this work, we're also wanting to remove the outdated restrictions on social dancing within bars and venues and align our zoning with the city's council's intentions when they repealed the cabaret laws. As part of City for Economic Opportunity, we're wanting to address the fact that when buildings convert from one activity or one use to a different one, right now they might have a need for additional loading docks beyond what makes sense. And so we want to make sure that our existing buildings can remain occupied as the economy changes over time. As part of City for Economic Opportunity, we're also wanting to develop a range of new zoning tools that could be created and mapped in a particular area in the future to support job growth. And this would include some mid-density industrial districts that would mimic the historic density of our loft style buildings in these areas. And this is the example of the film lighting rental business that just wants to add a couple of floors. And there are no tools in our zoning that can allow industrial businesses to grow today. And finally, as we're being more permissive about activities that we're allowing within businesses and spaces, we also want to ensure that spaces are designed to be attractive and activate our sidewalks. And so we're proposing more clear and consistent design requirements for our commercial districts. And so with that, I'll turn things over to Veronica to talk about City of Housing Opportunity.
Good evening. I'm Veronica Brown, the Department of City Planning's Housing Division. Winnie Shen, also from Housing Division, and I are here excited to tell you about City of Housing Opportunity. Next slide, please. The proposal ideas that we'll share tonight emerge directly from where we live, the city's Fair Housing Report that was created by HPD with over 150 community organizations and dozens of meetings across the city. The experiences shared throughout where we live highlight the human costs of our housing shortage. Not only high rents, but displacement pressure, segregation, gentrification, tenant harassment, and homelessness. All the worst things about housing in New York City are a direct result of there not being enough housing for people. Where we live also offers an honest appraisal of how we got to where we are today, which is a very diverse but extremely segregated city that doesn't offer New Yorkers adequate housing opportunities. The report outlines goals and strategies that we as a city can take to further fair housing principles. As a part of this work, the proposals that we'll share tonight aim to remove many of the obstacles to equitable housing development. We believe that relatively small changes to the zoning across a wide geography can create a lot of housing. And when every neighborhood does its part, no single neighborhood will be unfairly targeted or face dramatic changes. Next slide, please. We're talking to you very early in the process, before we've started to draft zoning text for the proposals themselves. We're sharing our current ideas as they stand to answer your questions and gather your feedback. So what would a city of housing opportunity look like in practice? Here are some of the things that we're currently looking at. First, we want to allow housing types that serve everyone. We're thinking about types that have historically filled an important gap in the housing market, but that we've made difficult or impossible to achieve, often as part of land use regulation's legacy of racial and economic exclusion. These housing types include accessory dwelling units, studio apartments, and shared housing models, each of which could help meet people's urgent housing needs today. Next, we want to ease conversions of underutilized non-residential buildings into housing. This accomplishes two important planning goals, both creating more housing and giving new life to obsolete buildings. We also want to prioritize people over parking. This means reducing or eliminating parking requirements where our research demonstrates that they're unnecessarily preventing the construction of new housing. We also want to give all forms of affordable housing, including supportive housing, the same preference that we already give to affordable senior residences in medium and high density districts. By expanding this preference to forms of affordable housing beyond senior housing, we can promote the equitable development of these units across the city. Finally, we want to make it easier for owners of homes and small buildings to get what they need from the city, whether that's us at the Department of City Planning or one of our sister agencies like DOB, HPD, or BSA. You shouldn't need to have an expediter on staff or even know what an expediter is in order to adapt your home to meet your family's needs. Next slide, please. Now we'll move through 6 examples that illustrate these proposal ideas. First, we want to eliminate barriers that prevent you from building what a zoning district already claims to allow. Here we have a single-family home located in a 2-family district. Let's say you wanted to add a small second unit to your home for your elderly mother, something that you might think would be straightforward given that your property zoning district allows 2-family homes. Well, the hyper-specific regulations that we've layered on over the years basically make this impossible. First, there'd be a requirement for a second off-street parking space, even though your mom, like many residents of small units and multifamily buildings, doesn't drive. In addition, the large minimum unit size, larger than your mother even wants, would be impossible to accommodate in your building. Zoning also blocks you from adding an exterior staircase as an entry to a second-floor unit on this lot, meaning you'd have to undertake major interior renovations that would be cost prohibitive and impractical. So in reality, you wouldn't be able to do a 2-family house in what is supposedly a 2-family district. We'd like to change that. Through adjustments to the zoning, we can make it simple to build a 2-family house in a 2-family district. By addressing some of the restrictions that we've layered on incrementally over the decades, we can make our districts actually do what they claim to do. Next slide, please. Staying in the low density parts of the city for our next example, we'd like to reallow successful building types that already exist in these areas. Here, you have a building form that probably looks familiar to anyone who's spent time in Queens or other low density parts of the city. There's 2 or 3 stories of residential above a ground floor with local retail. If the owner of the 1-story building on the left wanted to replicate that today, they'd quickly find out that it's impossible. First, the combined parking requirements for both commercial and residential are so high that the site just doesn't have enough room to provide them. These parking spaces prevent the construction of a mixed-use building, regardless of whether or not it's a realistic expectation that residents or retail customers would actually be using a car. Secondly, even though every building up and down the block is built like what you see on the right, height limits and floor area limits that were imposed after these successful buildings were realized make it impossible to replicate their mixed-use form. We'd like to look at adjustments to low-density commercial districts to make this type of housing possible as well. Next slide, please. We also want to enable other forms of housing across the city that many New Yorkers know and love. Here, we have a building full of simple, no-frills studios. Although New York has many such buildings, you wouldn't be able to build one today because we implemented minimum average unit sizes in the 1961 zoning resolution. We know that a lot of people in New York City want to live alone, but they can't. By not providing this variety of housing options, we currently force people into roommate situations or other unstable living arrangements. We want to change that and instead encourage housing types that serve everyone, which will also help to relieve pressure on family-size units elsewhere in the city. For example, in today's housing market, younger New Yorkers are forced to find roommates and take multi-bedroom apartments in neighborhoods around the city. Elderly people are trapped in large homes that are a burden for them to maintain, and marginally housed populations are left in unsafe or exploitative living situations. We can adjust the rules to make a variety of housing types possible, allowing people to make their own choices about where they want to live. Next slide, please.
As Veronica described, one of our goals is to ease conversions of obsolete and underutilized buildings to housing. So what would that look like? Let's say we have a vacant hotel that was acquired by a housing nonprofit, and the nonprofit wants to convert it to supportive housing. However, the staff of the nonprofit will soon realize that our current zoning regulations would make that difficult. The relaxed regulations we have to facilitate the adaptive reuse of non-residential buildings would not be applicable since supportive housing falls into the use group of community facility, not residential. That means the nonprofit would be stuck with an overbuilt building that doesn't comply with light and air standards, and they wouldn't be able to convert it to supportive housing. If the nonprofit then tried to convert the building to residential, they run into an obstacle caused by the dwelling unit factor, which determines the minimum average unit size. The required minimum average unit size is far greater than the current size of these hotel rooms. So a nonprofit would need to combine hotel rooms, do some serious renovations, and in the end, they likely need to market those units as high-end housing to justify the construction costs, which is a very different outcome from the original goal of creating more supportive housing. Other issues that complicate conversions are that current regs only apply in certain parts of New York City, such as Manhattan below 60th Street, parts of Queens and Brooklyn that are along the East River, so there is also a geographic limitation. They're also limited in terms of the age of the buildings that can use them in most places. The building will need to have been built before 1961. So we're looking into different ways to address these challenges and make our conversion regulations more broadly applicable, so we can turn more of these obsolete and underutilized non-residential buildings into the affordable and supportive housing that New Yorkers need. Next slide, please. Another one of our goals is to give all supportive and affordable housing the same preference already given to affordable senior housing. For this example, we're turning to Bushwick. Let's say there's a church that's interested in rebuilding and even including housing on top of the church building. Because of existing zoning regulations, the church would be limited to about 35 units, but they want to build more units because they recognize their community needs housing. One way they could do that is by adding affordable senior housing, which gets a higher FAR than other types of housing. What does a higher FAR mean? The higher the permitted FAR, the larger a building is allowed to be, and the more people that can be housed. However, that higher FAR would only apply if the affordable units were set aside for seniors. Well, what about other families or New Yorkers who aren't seniors who need affordable housing? Currently, non-age restricted affordable housing gets a lower FAR. We're thinking of giving the same FAR to all forms of affordable and supportive housing as we do already for senior affordable. By doing so, we could increase the availability of affordable housing across the city. While an additional 10 or 12 units in this one corner in Bushwick may not seem like a lot, but if hundreds of similar sites were also able to add an additional 10 or 12 affordable units, the number of affordable housing available would really add up. Next slide, please. As touched on earlier, we're interested in reducing or eliminating unnecessary parking requirements to allow for more housing development. So moving next door from Bushwick to Bed-Stuy, there's this developer interested in building out this lot and adding a residential building. While this lot could fit up to 20 units, rather than build that many units, developer stops at just 10 so he can waive out of the parking requirement. Because as soon as he adds that 11th unit, he'd have to fulfill a 6-spot parking requirement, which would be difficult to fit on this site. If we make adjustments to the waiver threshold or to the requirement ratio, or to decide this is an area where parking should be optional, we could see an additional 10 apartments on this block. Again, 10 apartments may not seem like a lot, but when hundreds of sites across New York are able to build more housing, that result in a lot more housing available to New Yorkers. Overall, we want to prioritize people over parking, and by doing so, we can reduce development costs, make streets safer, and enable the creation of more housing that help neighborhoods thrive. Next slide. Thank you very much. That was a brief overview of the City for Housing Opportunity proposals, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, team. It was great to hear from you all. And we're excited to hear from your questions and answer them now. I think we'll start with going through how to unmic. If we can go to the next slide. So as a reminder, you can raise your hand. You can raise your hand using the indicator on the bottom of your screen, If you are on the phone, press *9 to raise your hand. And if you would like to submit by email, you can submit to dcpcityofyes_dl@planning.nyc.gov. And Tom, I think you're going to do the next slides.
Yes, I am. When it is your turn to speak, your name will be called and you'll be granted temporary speaking privileges by Department of City Planning staff, and you will be promoted to panelist. This will allow you to unmute your microphone and the ability to turn on your camera. Please note that promoting speakers takes some time, so we ask that everyone be patient. Once your name has been called, we will help you unmute your microphone and you will be asked to convey your questions. To allow us to hear from everyone who wishes to speak, we ask you to please limit your remarks to 3 minutes. A 3-minute countdown clock will run on the screen. If you are participating online at the 3-minute mark, your time will expire. At that time, you will be asked to conclude your remarks. If you choose to turn on your camera, we will be able to see you. Next slide, please. An additional note of instructions for those of you joining us by phone today. If you wish to ask questions via telephone, please select *9 when prompted. Please listen for me to call out the last 3 digits of the phone number. At that point, you will be given the temporary ability to speak. You must press *6 to unmute your telephone, and we will be able to hear you speak. When your testimony is complete or your 3 minutes have expired, whichever comes first, you must press *6 again to mute yourself. Please note that the muting and unmuting of speakers may take a moment. Next slide, please. Speakers from the general public have 3 minutes to ask your questions or provide a comment. There are a few exceptions to the 3-minute limit. Elected officials, for example, are given the courtesy of jumping to the front of the queue and are not limited to 3 minutes. To those of you viewing us on live stream and wishing to ask questions, please be mindful of potential background noise while speaking. Make sure that the live stream is muted when you begin to speak to avoid hearing an echo. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Tom. So we have some questions building in the Q&A. I think I'll go to a live request first. Michelle Birnbaum. And Michelle, if I'm correct, you also submitted by email. So if those are the same questions, let us know. You can unmute and put your camera on if you please.
Michelle, you should have the ability to unmute your microphone and turn on your camera.
Yes, thank you very much.
Hi.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to read a few of my questions just so that they get into the record, if that's okay. And then to the extent that you have time to answer, that would be great. Realizing that people either rented or purchased housing in the communities whose characteristic they prefer, will you attempt to change those neighborhoods in accordance with your perceived housing needs? For example, single family house zoning for multi-family house zoning so that an apartment building could conceivably be built next to a single family home, thus changing the character of the neighborhood. Will it be your aim to integrate incarceration facilities into residential neighborhoods? Will you mandate recladding of pre-war buildings in an effort to preserve energy? Will you mandate any changes to building exteriors in historic districts? Will you mandate that all buildings be electric for both old and new constructions? And what are you doing to ensure that electricity is plentiful and affordable? At the moment, it is neither. Will you pursue this path even if there's a shortage of electricity, which could result in blackouts? Rather than installing electric charging stations on city streets, would you model such stations after a gas station model and put multiple stations in one designated location? Some years ago, the CPC eliminated the requirements that parking be built for new construction. Would you consider now requiring such parking instead of in light of the fact that congestion pricing may be coming into effect, which will make those zones near the construction pricing zone more crowded with cars, and they may need place to put them? At this time, finding a high school for a child can send them to schools in all the 5 boroughs without consideration of where they live, resulting in a grave inconvenience for families who would like to, for children who would like to participate in after-school activities, but find that such participation sends them home on public transportation after dark. Will you consider allowing communities and boards to have their own 197A plans? Are you using the structure of your organization as it is laid out in the Plan NYC documents? Will you maintain a livable and respectful apartment size? And lastly, when will you release details, as the devil is certainly in the details? So to the extent that you can answer some or any of these tonight, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much for a very comprehensive presentation, but I'd like to nail down a few things as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate all of your questions. I think you've submitted most of them. Hopefully we'll certainly watch this and make sure that we answer them if we can't tonight in some other form. That was a few different people who would respond to this. First, I want to say that we're working right now to get the details. So tonight, as was last week and the next few months, we're really working hard to hear from you, develop the proposals with input from the community and New Yorkers. So tonight is an info session to tell you where we're at right now. And we look forward to building these proposals throughout the next several months going forward. I'm going to hand it to the housing team first to maybe answer a couple of your questions. And I'm sorry if we missed some of them. There was quite a few, but we'll try to answer as many as we can. And then I think, Nylis, if you could answer some of her questions related to carbon neutrality.
Sure, I'll take your first question about neighborhoods that are predominantly single family homes. So I want to reiterate that one of the goals of this project is to have every neighborhood in the city contribute to meeting our city's urgent housing needs. And so that includes all districts and neighborhoods. We're looking at options that would be suitable for those geographies. And I'll also emphasize that this, as I mentioned, the first example, many single family homes are in 2-family districts or low density multifamily districts. And so in those neighborhoods, we want to make homes able to realize what they're already nominally allowed, so 2-family or multifamily housing. And we also want to look into introducing appropriate new housing types where they might be appropriate. I'll pass to Nylis to answer the carbon questions.
Sure. Thanks, Veronica. So on mandating recladding of pre-war buildings and mandating changes in historic districts. So first, I just want to emphasize we do not foresee imposing any new requirements as part of City of Carbon Neutrality. The project is really intended to support home and business owners in making the retrofits and upgrades they need to make, whether that's electively or if that's in order to comply with Local Law 97. And so to provide that support, our research is focused on alleviating zoning impediments to those retrofitting projects. So again, we don't anticipate imposing any new requirements as part of this project. On electrification, a key piece of decarbonization as a general principle that applies outside of New York City is reducing our city's overall energy needs by increasing energy efficiency. So through a combination of increases in efficiency and growth in distributed renewable generation, we will meet the energy needs of our city's future. Our work supporting the rollout of energy storage, for example, will also reduce brownouts and blackouts during peak energy events or storm emergencies. And we continue to work closely. We have been, and we will continue to work closely with our partners at Con Edison, the primary electrical utility, and NYSERDA, the state agency, as we continue to develop our research on zoning impediments to electrification. There's a question about EV charging. So to support EV rollout, we will need a combination of on-street and off-street charging. And at DCP, our zoning rules regulate off-street parking. So we are particularly focused on supporting the growth of off-street EV charging, as you asked. Open to the public facilities are currently permitted under zoning, but only in our city's manufacturing districts and only in about half of our city's commercial districts. And this, as of right, allowance is something that we're looking at expanding to get even more of these facilities, badly needed facilities in the city. So I think I think I got all of them. Yeah. So hopefully that helps, and thanks very much for the great questions.
Thank you both for those very comprehensive answers to those questions. I don't see any other hands raised. Am I wrong, team? So I think we should go to, well, why don't we, I just saw Elizabeth raise her hand. So let's, Elizabeth, and then we'll go to questions in the actual chat.
Sorry, I put my questions in the Q&A and I wasn't sure how you were going in process. So I'm a resident of the Upper East Side of Manhattan. We are among the most dense neighborhoods in the city. And we have a couple of frustrations that I would hope you guys could support. The first is that we are seeing demolitions of buildings and replacement by new residential facilities that actually have fewer units than the buildings that they are replacing, in spite of the fact that they are replacing a 5-story building with 20-story buildings. So clearly there is significantly greater density going on, significantly greater FAR, and yet the number of units are going down. And so in your city of yes, I'd love to see some requirements for greater, if you are building at greater density, there must also be greater units. Similarly, we are one of the parts of the city that frankly has no height caps on our buildings. And developers of luxury housing are looking to maximize height in order to capture views. Or would you consider creating caps on building height, in many cases lower than they may be today, or where they don't exist today, but then building incentives for adding additional affordable units? So again, this is not a this is a, how do we help encourage the greater production of affordable units and the greater total number of units in areas that are already incredibly dense?
Thank you for that. And please, everyone, please ask your questions in any way that's most comfortable to you. Feel free to raise your hand and ask online, or please use the chat, whichever is more comfortable to you. I'm going to hand it over to our housing team. I think John Mangian from our housing team might be responding to this.
Sure. Hi, folks. John Mangian from the Housing Division. Thanks for your questions. I appreciate it. Demolition and redevelopment with fewer units, we really are watching that closely and really see it as a symptom of an overly constrained housing market, where we've layered on restriction after restriction, like Veronica described, such that the only way to build something is to tear something else down. If the zoning in every neighborhood allows incremental housing growth, you move away from that kind of zero-sum housing market. And so with City of Housing Opportunity, we're really going after the underlying cause rather than just trying to, outlaw a symptom that you mentioned. Ironically, height caps are one of those restrictions that really incentivizes demolition and redevelopment of the type you asked about in the first part of the question. And so we're not, as part of City of Housing Opportunity, looking to implement more restrictions that lead to some of those unintended consequences. And in fact, the opposite, like Veronica and Winnie outlined, trying to remove some of those obstacles to allow incremental housing growth in every neighborhood around the city, so you don't see that type of zero-sum thing that you asked about in the first part of your question. As far as affordable units go, virtually every initiative that Veronica and Winnie described, especially in the medium and higher density districts, is intended to provide more space for affordable units, or to serve as, to be as complementary as we can to either privately financed affordable housing through our inclusionary housing programs, or through subsidy programs by, sister agencies like HPD or other levels of government. So it's a huge focus of Zoning for Housing Opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. Jay, Alita, we'll come right back to you. I want to make sure that we get some questions from the Q&A as well. First question, there's quite a few questions for carbon neutral. So I'll be passing it off to Nihilus, but starting with Mark Shiflett's question. Any thoughts to implement code changes and incentives to encourage the use of composting toilets in single and multifamily buildings?
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. It's an interesting idea. It's a good question. Regulations of this type are governed by the building code, not our zoning rules. And thus far, we haven't identified zoning impediments that as part of our research that we could alleviate to this in the future. If code were to change to allow it, I think is the key thing. So if code changes to allow it, there's no zoning impediments that we've identified that would stop it in the future. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Nihilus. Appreciate that. I think actually Alita is next in the Q&A. So why don't we just go really quickly back to live questions, and Jay, if you want to unmute and feel free to turn your camera on if you'd like. Hi, Jay.
Hi, can you hear me clearly?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Thank you. Two quick questions. I've heard the catchphrase "people over parking." I wanted to submit another catchphrase, which would be "homeless and singles over families," which may be what's occurring. Here's the idea: 3-bedroom or more apartments. The city has the amount of 4-person or more households, according to the census, is around 22% of all the units. 22% of all the units, 4-person or more households. Yet the city is building, in terms of new construction, a lot for singles, a lot for homeless also, partly because the New York City zoning code incentivizes, when it comes to affordable housing, studios, 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom, not for 3-bedroom. So my question is, in terms of families, which make up neighborhoods, which is what makes New York City great, different racial, ethnic, and cultural neighborhoods with families, would the city consider having in terms of an equitable standpoint, having changing the zoning code to have a certain amount of 3-bedroom, to incentivize 3-bedroom apartments, so that you can have more families who could move in? So that's the first question that goes to, what are you doing for families in terms of incentivizing it? Because it seems like it's almost like a zero-sum game. You get rid of the parking, families need parking, they need cars. You get rid of that, you're gonna hurt families who many times you have multi-generational families housing so high, you have a grandfather, kids, and then grandkids in the house. So my question goes to families and whether or not New York City has a fair housing problem in not providing housing for families because of the way it's incentivizing studios, 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms, and not doing anything for 3 bedrooms. That's question number one. The second question goes to segregation. Is that New York, I notice that there is oversaturation of social services in certain neighborhoods where a lot of the supportive housing, which most of the time is for homeless or formerly homeless, many times that's concentrated in neighborhoods of color. Many times it's lower income places. Is the city looking at where it's putting a lot of the social services, the homeless shelters, are they looking at where they're putting it in terms of fair share? Because the fair share law mostly is for government facilities. So now everyone's getting away with it by just saying, okay, we're gonna contract it out to non-government, which is the supportive housing. And of particular attention is Clarkson Avenue in Brooklyn. There is a tremendous amount of supportive housing, right after supportive housing, right after supportive housing. Is New York City looking at the percentage in terms of beds, of residential beds in certain neighborhoods?
Time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's make sure we can answer your questions here. I'm going to hand it over to the housing team.
Hi, thanks for your question. So I'm going to address your first question about family size apartments and small apartments. So this text amendment does focus on providing housing opportunities for all New Yorkers, which includes families, includes people experiencing homelessness and others. So as I mentioned during the presentation, by creating a variety of housing units that includes small apartments, it'll free up family size units for families. As I said, currently we have a situation in which roommates or single people might be forced to take roommates when they'd rather live alone, and that takes up a unit with multiple bedrooms that could be occupied by a family. We don't have plans to mandate large apartments, but there are bedroom mix requirements, I'll note, for affordable housing. Your second question about supportive housing, I'll pass to John, or if someone else from the team wants to answer that one.
Hello, thanks for your questions, Jay. On supportive housing, you'll remember one of the proposals was to provide additional floor area for supportive housing in medium and higher density districts across the city. And one of the primary aims of that is to encourage incremental growth in supportive housing opportunities across the widest range of the city in all medium and higher density districts. And so to avoid some of the issues with concentration that you mentioned. But that's the extent to which City of Housing Opportunity addresses that particular issue.
But we thank you for your comments on that. So I'm going to turn to Alita Camp. I know you submitted quite a few into the chat as well, so I want to make sure you have the opportunity to speak to them. And then I'll go back to the chat questions. Are you able to unmic?
Yes, and I did. I realized. Thank you. And I wanted to thank you for allowing me to keep my camera off. I would appreciate your answering the questions in the chat, which range from environmental to questions about small businesses. But right now, I wanted to take this opportunity to ask a little bit further about the question that Elizabeth raised, which has to do with allowing our neighborhood, which is the densest probably in the country, to maintain the little affordable housing units that we have left. We've lost 14,000 affordable housing units since approximately 2007, which we had hired an urban planner to determine. And that is because there is no height limit, and developers put in market rate housing that reaches up to the sky, in some instances 50-story buildings, and believe that the nature of the neighborhood has to factor into the City of Yes plan, that we're already so dense with increased stresses on infrastructure, on schools, on public transportation, on sanitation, on the congestion of the streets with delivery trucks and Ubers and delivery guys on bikes and little motorcycles, that to not recognize that preservation of the affordable housing and the small businesses that we have is essential to keeping people having housing security and health security and education security. So I just wanted to raise that and to see whether there is an adjustment or a place in the thinking to recognize that different neighborhoods have different issues and that there is no one size fits all. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Our housing team.
Sorry about that. I took that to be more of a comment than a question. Things to keep in mind. And at city planning, I can assure you that we've been laying the groundwork for this text amendment for going on years now, even though there's a long way to go before we formulate the details of the proposal. And much of that work involves going neighborhood to neighborhood around the city. You know, the meetings that we have every week looking at the existing context, the existing fabrics of neighborhoods around the city to inform the creation of these proposals, you know, I think would go a great way to assure you that we definitely are considering the differences between neighborhoods as we formulate what will be, you know, varied and nuanced approaches to ensuring that every neighborhood can do its part to provide housing in the years ahead.
So I'm going to go back to the Q&A now, and there's a couple questions, just process questions that I thought I would just address now, and then we can kind of go back into some of the policy questions. What is the process and timing for DCP to make these proposed changes and for them to be enacted into law? And the other one is, will you provide a copy of the presentation? Absolutely. The presentation will be on the Department of City Planning's website, as well a copy of this this live stream will be on the City Planning YouTube channel. So you can rewatch this, as well as find the presentation on our website. And for the process, like I said, we're really in the, you know, listening and trying to create the proposals right now. So there's going to be quite a few more public meetings, as you heard from our executive director, Edith Suchin. And we will hopefully be able to, you know, think about referring these out in the spring for the City of Yes carbon neutrality. And probably we'll be taking some more time for the economic opportunity and the housing opportunity proposals, as those are complex and we'll need a little bit more time to be able to write those up and to think about the process for that. So I would say the focus right now is thinking about carbon neutrality for the spring. Next, I'll go to Alita's other question, which was, if buildings are responsible for 90% of emissions, as the governor has stated, or 70% of emissions as the Times reports, why aren't you focused on construction, particularly where new buildings demolish affordable housing units and replace them with taller buildings? That have fewer units. In addition, these new buildings put a lot of stress on infrastructure, including provisions of electricity and delivery of gas. They are led to more deliveries with diesel trucks, more taxis, more Ubers, and other needs that add to increased environmental stress. How do you reconcile development of luxury housing concentrated in one area with the plan? This is kind of going to your question, the statement that you've already that you recognize, you spoke to, I don't know if the housing team wants to add anything to that, but I think that's a really important comment that, we'll take back.
This is Niles from the carbon neutral team. I was hearing some mentions about emissions, so I'll just offer some response there too. The question was about how do you reconcile development with our plan, and I'd say that the plan, the city of carbon neutrality, is really one that's focused on updating our zoning rules to support building owners and making the retrofits to their existing buildings to increase efficiency, electrify their systems, and support biking, micromobility, and electric vehicle usage. So absolutely looking to reduce the stress on infrastructure through seeing this sort of transformational retrofitting in line with our climate goals and in line with 80 by 50. So hopefully that's helpful. But thank you for raising that.
Thank you, Niles, for that addition. We'll now go to Michael's question, which was, would you or how would you consider provisions to preserve and maximize sunlight in high-density residential areas? Also, what provisions are you considering for ensuring green spaces and public recreation spaces to support residents in areas with increased density? I think that could be towards our housing team.
Hi, so to answer your question about concerns about sunlight in high density residential areas, I think that the overarching goal of this project is to add housing to both high density areas and low density areas, while of course being attentive to concerns of each of those communities. But we are, focused on adding housing here. The question about green space, I will let someone else take if they have anything to add on that. But we'll note your concern in any event, and yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we could just add, again, sort of the animating principle of the whole City for Housing Opportunity enterprise is to ensure that every neighborhood is doing its part, and understanding that when every neighborhood does its part, that no individual neighborhoods are overburdened or have to experience dramatic changes. And so, that's one of our bedrock principles here.
Okay, let's go back to a question on economic opportunity, actually. How would uniformity and consistency in streetscape rules allow for vibrancy in different neighborhoods? Each neighborhood has had a style unique to that neighborhood. Consistency requirements throughout the city would lead to a dull and drab uniformity, rather than the vibrancy that leads to more livable neighborhoods, which are also bring in visitors. Is that the aim of the plan? Matt, do you want to talk about?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Lara, and thank you, Alita, for the question. Today, we have a whole hodgepodge of different rules regarding our streetscape, and they all seem to have the same goal of encouraging activity. But it's oftentimes very confusing for business owners to understand. And in our zoning resolution, our streetscape is currently in a bunch of different places. So it's when we say consistency, we're trying to make it easier for business owners to understand what they can do, and make it easier to comply with all of these different rules. So it's hard. And so we want to make it easier while maintaining overall vibrancy. And I thank you for that question and opportunity to clarify a little bit.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate that. Sorry, let me go back and see. Another question for you, Matt, is the commercial zoning that restricts the size of retail spaces may do a lot to help support small businesses and prevent the large chains and banks from dominating streets. Is there any plan to include commercial zones to encourage small businesses? As you know, massive increases in rent have forced out small businesses. Commercial size requirements may help small businesses and their neighborhoods.
Thank you, Lara, and thank you again, Alita, for this important question. And as many of us know, the vast majority of businesses in New York City, and as the borough president noted, small businesses are part of what makes New York so special and important. And the majority of our businesses on neighborhood retail streets are small businesses, and we want to make sure that we keep it that way. And so we're working very closely with our colleagues at the Department of Small Business Services to do just that. And as I described earlier, we're finding in many cases that size limitations are standing in the way of existing small business just to grow and expand in place. So the example of the bakery that I gave earlier, 750 square feet is a really small specific limitation in our zoning that prohibits a neighborhood bakery from being able to expand what they do on site while remaining in the neighborhood, creating vibrancy, and making sure that they're serving customers who live in the neighborhood. And so in many instances, we want to make it in this initiative easier for businesses to adapt, and including things like being able to take over a vacant space that's next door. And we think this is really critical to supporting small businesses and supporting their continued presence on our commercial streets. So thank you for the question.
Matt, you should stay on. We have a couple more.
Okay.
There's some questions about, you know what, I can't see the full question for some reason. Are you proposing changes to use groups in zoning districts?
Yeah, this is a great question, Doris. And yes, is the short answer. In my presentation, I was trying to use the word activities rather than use groups, but that's precisely what we mean. And so we would like to change use groups to make them easier to understand in our zoning. For those who might be unfamiliar, our zoning resolution defines very, very precisely many different kinds of uses, to the point that you are told exactly where a telegraph store can exist, but not a cell phone store. And so in many instances, our zoning, which was last comprehensively looked at in 1961, just hasn't kept up with our changing economy. So our broad idea, and we definitely welcome your feedback and ideas on this, would be to broaden our definitions. So instead of defining this kind of store and that kind of store, we would just say in our neighborhood commercial districts, we can allow neighborhood sized stores. And we would like to be able to, as much as we can, make it easier for businesses, again, to understand where they can locate and what they can do. And that's the overarching theme of this, is to make sure that our zoning is allowing rather than hampering economic growth and locating of businesses. So I thank you for the question. It's a great one.
And another question for you, Matt, is you mentioned adding loading zones, which will increase truck traffic when we already have truck crisis in our city. Can you focus in a little bit on just talking through how that will be addressed?
Absolutely. This is also an important question, Doris. And I thank you for the feedback on that. It's something that we'll be studying through the environmental review that we're doing. But our anticipation is that the effect of the specific change we want to make will be limited, because what we're proposing to do is for existing buildings, and specifically existing buildings that would have one loading requirement if you're, say, an office, and a different loading requirement, a much higher one if you are a manufacturing business. But again, this hasn't been changed in over 60 years. And so we think that in many instances, the kinds of businesses that would be manufacturing no longer need that very high requirement of loading docks. And so, of course, this would not apply to what I think you're getting at, which is distribution facilities, for instance. This is for repurposing of existing spaces for one kind of use to a different kind of use. And it's especially occurring in our industrial loft style buildings as well. But again, this is something we're looking at very closely, and we'll continue to have conversations around this, particularly with our partners at the Department of Transportation.
Thank you, Matt. Really appreciate that. A question that came in, if you're adding housing, you will also want neighborhood retail and animated streetscapes. How does this work with adding housing?
Hi, thanks for this question. It's a great point. So I walked through one example of this in the presentation, that our current zoning prohibits or prevents you from realizing a mixed building in which you have residential above ground floor retail. And that is something that we want to allow. There are existing examples of those buildings that are in successful commercial corridors that exist from before the current zoning, and we would like to reintroduce those types. And that would, a big obstacle to that currently is the parking requirements, and such a building would have to comply with both commercial and residential parking requirements, but they would also be prevented currently through strict floor area limits and height limits. So things like that we will also be taking a look at in order to realize the exact kind of development that you are mentioning, in which that offer local retail and residential development in tandem. So thank you.
Thank you, Veronica, for that. Remember, you can also raise your hand if you would like to ask your question live. Otherwise, I'll keep going through some of these. We are at 8:40. So coming to time soon, but I will say that we definitely will be taking all of these questions back, making sure to address them and provide some FAQs as well, and keep these conversations going where we can continue to have conversations and ask more questions for each other. So another question for carbon neutral. 67 to 75% of all of our climate change pollution is caused by tall buildings. One example of height as the main cause of pollution is the Platinum LEED certified Bank of America building in Midtown. Green roofs, alternative energy, etc. are a given. Will you accommodate the science on height causing irreparable climate harm in your citywide zoning plans?
Thanks for the question. The challenge for that particular building is that it contains a very electricity intensive use that's fairly unique in Midtown, a trading floor. And that's really points to the need that our electricity, in order to not cause environmental harm, our electrical grid needs to be greened. We need to be drawing from renewable sources, wind and solar, to power our city. So I would focus on that as the main takeaway, that with this, City of Carbon Neutrality, we're really trying to focus on and emphasize supporting the crucial shift of New York City's energy grid to renewable sources.
Thank you, Nihilus. No hands raised. Okay, let's keep going. This is a question for the Housing Opportunity team. Trying to understand example 2. Would this text change enable residential housing to be built in all low density commercial zones? If not, what would be the specific criteria? Would there be height limits? What would prevent a developer from requesting a spot rezoning afterwards to not create out of context buildings?
Hi, so to take the first part of this question, residential construction is already allowed in most low density commercial zones. What I was describing in that example, perhaps, that just to cover that again, is that it's not perhaps easily realized today because of the very restrictive zoning, but residential use is allowed in a low density commercial district. And so we would just make that feasible under these changes. And the specifics of the changes, which I think is sort of what your second question is about, are obviously still under consideration as we're in the earlier stages of this proposal, as we mentioned. So we're still looking at specific things like what the height or floor area limits would be in these districts. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. Looks like we have Alita asked a clarifying question. To clarify my previous question, what would it be worthwhile to allow while it would be worthwhile to allow small businesses such as a bakery or pottery studio to expand, would it be possible to allow such expansion for businesses that would preclude landlords or new developments from merging spaces to rent to national chains that would pay higher rents? Is there language that would allow expansion to support small businesses while not allowing it where spaces would be expanded for rental chains and bank drugstores? I would support allowing small businesses to expand to enable their success, but would object to the manipulation of those abilities to suit rentals to businesses that are not small or local. I appreciate that that clarification, and we'll definitely be thinking about that as we're working through the proposal. Another question, are you using the same structure for implementation of this plan when it's finalized?
I think I can take that.
Okay.
These projects, when they are finalized, will enter the full public review process. These would be zoning text amendments that would be reviewed by the community boards and borough presidents before returning to the City Planning Commission, and then being reviewed by the City Council for final adoption. So this would follow the standard public review process for any such zoning text change. We have no intention of changing how that functions for this type of application. Similarly, these projects would all follow the standard environmental review process, where for environmental assessment statements, they would need to be completed by the time of certification, and draft environmental impact statements would also be needed to be completed by the time of referral, and the final environmental impact statement would have to be completed prior to the City Planning Commission vote. So it follows the standard process that we have used for these amendments for decades.
Yes, thank you, Tom. For sure, these are public info sessions that are open to everyone, but we're definitely going to be going through the formal process. We want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to help shape these now, and we will be working with community boards and continue to have these type of info sessions before we refer them to the City Planning Commission to be certified and to go through the proper ULURP process. One more question I think we have. It's 8:45. I'm just recognizing the time, and I thank you all for staying on. I understand reducing parking requirements. However, there are communities in New York City that are mass transit dead zones, so people rely on cars. How will you address the needs of residents in mass transit dead zones?
Hi, thanks for your question. So we recognize that there are areas in the city that are pretty far from most public transit locations and where cars are still really important, but we think there is room to better align parking requirements with demand to further our goal of making sure we have easier chance of developing more housing to address the housing crisis that the city's in. But thank you for your question.
Thank you for that. We recognize that there's not a one size fits all, but there's definitely ways that we can think about these in a strategic way across the city. So with that, is there anybody who has any questions that they wanted to raise? Oops, sorry. Alita, I see you have your hand up.
Thank you very much for allowing me another opportunity to ask a question. There are a lot of buildings in my neighborhood that are unaffordable by even relatively wealthy New Yorkers, where starting prices for condos are $7 million, $10 million, or $5 million. These seem to be marketed to foreign investors. And I'm wondering if you see these as an obstacle to providing housing for New Yorkers, because if those buildings are going up, then clearly buildings, even if they don't meet the AMI metric and are not considered truly affordable housing, are more affordable for New Yorkers, and how those types of construction or developments fit in with your plans. And I know it's not the only neighborhood. I imagine they are going up elsewhere around Manhattan, but they seem to prevent real housing for all kinds of New Yorkers from going up in their stead because they may be more profitable. Thank you.
Thank you, Alita, for that comment. I don't know if the team has anything they would want to add.
Sure. No, thanks a lot for that question. We appreciate it. And it goes back to the fundamentals of City of Housing Opportunity, which is to create more housing in neighborhoods across the city. And again, to just serve as a real complement to the efforts to create affordable housing, not only through our inclusionary programs, but through the subsidy programs of our sister agency and other levels of government. I mean, the main reason why housing in New York is so expensive and is getting more expensive is, as we all know, there's just not enough of it, especially in certain neighborhoods for people who want to live here. We've all seen the articles about, lines around the block for open houses. And, when things like that are happening, when the bidding wars for rental apartments, not even condos, are breaking out in lines to the open house, it's that kind of pressure from the housing shortage that sends housing costs skyrocketing. And so we really do face a housing shortage that we're trying to address by enabling more housing production in all neighborhoods around the city, and at the same time really encouraging and supporting affordable housing production as well, so that new development can be for families up and down the income spectrum.
Thank you, John. So it looks like, oh, now we have some hands up. Great. Michelle? Are you able to unmic, Michelle?
Yes, thank you. When the city sent to our boards, I was on the committee on our board evaluating your Plan NYC program, which defined a very specific structure, an organization that had an overseer, that had borough representatives, and that had oversight over community plans or suggestions, which is what I meant when I mentioned that in the chat. Is this overall program planning to implement that structure that's outlined in the Plan NYC program?
Is there someone that may know more about the Plan NYC that might be able to help with this?
And I'll get my second question in while somebody's thinking about that. And there are instances where community boards can institute their own 197 plans, 197A. Would you be open to that? Would this project be open to communities forming their own plans for their community and submitting them?
Of course, the 197A plans are important to our city and to the structures of the community boards. And, we'd be happy to work with people on 197As. At the same time, we have community liaisons who are consistently working with community boards and are happy to, think through frameworks and goals and values that we would like to see in your neighborhood. So I would definitely encourage you to speak to your community liaison, your DCP community liaison that can help you think through the best approach for how you would like to accomplish some of the goals for your neighborhood and the needs.
Okay, and as to the structure, of how your plan will be implemented, is anybody familiar with that as outlined in the Plan NYC documents?
I believe much of what was described in the Plan NYC documents was referring, when it's speaking of the formal process, was referring to ULURP, but generally the public review process where the community boards, borough presidents, borough cabinets have the ability to opine on any and all land use actions coming through public review. There are suggestions regarding how prior to public review, projects should be introduced to the public. And, we are following, best practices currently and starting these conversations very early. These proposals are in the very earliest phases of just information gathering.
My recollection, and maybe I'm wrong, because now, of course, I don't have the papers in front of me, but my recollection is that there was an internal structure. It wasn't so much about ULURP, but there was a panel consisting of a certain amount of people, and some represented the city. There were representatives within a borough, and then in the community. It was spelled out rather clearly. We worked on it very carefully, submitting suggestions about how it could be modified, changed, or improved in some way. But then that whole project seemed to have been dropped. And I just wondered if it's incorporated in your City of Yes. If this is the original Plan NYC with that original structure to be followed. And that had to do with the role of the council, with the role of people within the community. It was very carefully spelled out.
Yes.
Go ahead, Tom.
I think you may be referring to some suggestions for legislation that was being discussed in towards the end of the last administration. I believe what the ultimate Plan NYC documents was really referring to was the ULURP process, but we'll confirm and we can.
Okay, I just wondered how these two meshed, or perhaps the Plan NYC is no longer, in the works, or perhaps they've merged. I just wondered how one related to another, because that was a pretty comprehensive document.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. If any along the way, if you can just clarify if that's now at a dead end and we should just forget about it, or somehow if that's being integrated into what's going on now.
Okay, we'll definitely connect with you offline, and we can talk through it some more.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Andrew, I see your hands raised.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Technical mistake. Hold on one moment.
I think third time is the charm. How about now?
Yes.
You're here. Sorry.
No worries. It's been a long day, and thank you for staying on for so long and for putting on this event and for answering my previous question about environmental matters. And I just want to bring your attention to developments kind of gone awry in my neighborhood that hopefully will influence how this program is instituted. So on 72nd and 2nd, across from the new Q train or the 2nd Avenue subway, there was a development of 28 apartments, all rent stabilized. and it's been knocked down. It was a bunch of 5-story buildings. And in its place are going to be 2 new developments. One that's about 230 feet, so roughly 21 stories, and it has 54 units. So that sounds like a net gain of 26. But none of them are affordable. And it's building on the side a smaller building of just 4 units of affordable housing. So even though it seems like we've gone from 28 units to 58, which is a gain of 30, we've really gone from 28 units that were rent controlled to 4 apartments that are actually affordable. So we have a gain in terms of apartments, but a loss in terms of affordable apartments. And then the second development that seems to be a little problematic is that on 77th and 2nd, there's a new development that's going up. It's going to be around 500 feet, and it's replacing a bunch of 5-story buildings, but it's going to have the same net amount of apartments. So even with all of that height, we're not gaining any affordable housing. And in fact, now we're just missing our opportunity completely to actually add in new neighbors and add in new affordable units. So what structures or clauses can we put into this program so that what I just outlined there doesn't happen? And how also is it that the city can really institute those policies when so much of development is going to be dependent on a 421A tax break for developers who make affordable housing, because the city has so little power with regard to the state. So I'm really looking forward to making this initiative work in a way that's environmentally friendly, that's not short-sighted, that increases the amount of units that are actually affordable in all areas of the city, and that cleans our air and provides, good retail opportunities and spaces for community building. And I'm just looking forward to hearing what you have to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. John, did you want to try to address that?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if Andrew was on before when we answered the same question about those developments on the Upper East Side. Like I said before, we see that as a symptom of an overly constrained housing market where we've layered on so many restrictions that things have become zero sum, and to build anything, you have to tear down something else. That's become a particular problem on the Upper East Side. And so it's the entirety of zoning for housing opportunity is a response to that, by ensuring that we're removing obstacles in the zoning resolution, fixing zoning districts so that we can get housing production in lower, medium, higher density neighborhoods around the city to ameliorate that zero-sum situation. And again, providing more floor area, particularly for affordable and supportive housing, and making sure that our zoning works in lockstep with our sister agencies at HPD as we work together to create more affordable housing across the city. Thanks.
Thank you, John. So we've come on to 9 p.m. So I want to respect everybody's time and really appreciate you taking the time this evening to be with us to hear about these important proposals that are focused on, sustainability, creating more affordable housing, and creating more jobs in our city. So with that, I think that we're going to close up for the night. There was one last question about how can I become a city planner? And whoever asked that, I definitely would say, come talk to us. Feel free to reach out. There's positions on our website available, but we're always here to talk to people who are very interested in the field. So please reach out anytime. You can reach us at dcpcityofyes_dl@planning.nyc.gov. Or of course, you can reach out to me directly at Lara Marita, which is lmarita@planning.nyc.gov. With that, I thank you so much. Please continue to submit questions, continue to submit ideas. We really hope that we can, have a robust conversation about this and keep it going. We'll be in touch with more opportunities for these type of info sessions. But you can reach us at our email address, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.